What if it turned out that you had been lied to your entire life about freedom, morality, and the law? Few philosophical debates inspire as much interest as the one around free will. Most of us wander around each day with the implicit assumption that we are free in our choices. If we are standing in front of the toothpaste rack at Tesco, we may pick one tube, but we could have just as easily picked another. Or we could have walked out of the shop without buying anything. We are fundamentally the masters of our own fate. This intuition underlies much of our common sense philosophical system. It is what makes us so confident we can condemn others for their immoral actions. After all, they freely chose to do them. It is why just following orders is not considered a good enough excuse to commit a crime. And it allows us to think they got what they deserved when the consequences of someone's choices come back to bite them. But what would happen if we all suddenly dropped this belief in free will? How would we in our societies look if instead of this tacit belief in free choices, we were all instead determinists? What aspects of our philosophy or our political system would have to shift around this new belief? In Robert Sapolsky's Determined, A Life Without Free Will, he seeks to answer this very question. Get ready to learn why our notion of justice might be outdated, why there is no such thing as a good person, and so much more. I really enjoyed this book, and I do hope that you'll stay until the end of the video. Not only is it exactly the kind of practically minded philosophy that gets me excited, but there are also some fascinating criticisms of Sapolsky's conclusions that I cannot wait to share with you. But first, let's start with some groundwork, just so we're all on the same page. 1. The Freewill Debate, an oversimplified overview. What defines when an action is free? When pressed on this question, most people respond with something like, an action is free for an agent if it could have been otherwise and was caused by the agent's will. If the action wasn't caused by the agent, then it's not a choice, free or otherwise. And if the agent could not have done anything differently, then their decision was predetermined. And many people would say that they are thus no longer free. For instance, if it turned out that my choice of toothpaste could be explained by all of the causal factors leading up to that decision, then while we may say that it was a choice by me to get the toothpaste, a lot of people would not say that I had free will. This is called the libertarian definition of free will. The possible alternatives provides the free part, and the causality of the agent's will provides the will part. Lovely, neat definition. However, there are complications for this because of a philosophy known as determinism. This is Sapolsky's position, and it essentially argues that every event is predetermined, and this includes human decisions. Sapolsky's argument for this takes up most of the first half of the book, and it is extremely helpful, clear, and extensive. He points out how our genetics affect our propensity to make certain decisions, as do our hormone sensitivities. If we have an early traumatic experience, this can make us less able to control our emotional outbursts later in life. If we grow up around substance abuse or divorce or physical danger, this all has its toll on how our brain is structured, which in turn determines the decisions we will make further down the line. Sapolsky then argues against proposed solutions to this determinism, such as basing human free will on the indeterminacy found at the subatomic level, or an emergent property of deterministic systems. For Sapolsky, there is only one way to make free will exist. If an agent makes a decision that was not caused by anything else, yet is itself causal. He demonstrates that this is very likely not the case, and then concludes that free will is a myth. This is a really fantastic portion of the book, and whether you're a die-hard determinist or an outright libertarian, this section is definitely worth a read, because it is a systematic and detailed presentation of the nuts and bolts of the deterministic worldview, and the reasons we might want to accept it. A small comment I would have here is that while Sapolsky calls the theorists who argue for emergent indeterminacy or quantum indeterminacy compatibilists, he does not deal in detail with what most philosophers would call compatibilists. That is, people who think that completely predetermined choices are compatible with free will. This is done by arguing for a different definition of free will, where an action is free just if the causal chain of the action runs through the agent's decision-making process, with certain other stipulations depending on who you ask. So someone who decides to go to the shops and then does so is free in their action of going to the shops, whereas someone who is carried along to the shop kicking and screaming is not free because the events that take place are not in line with what they willed. I can understand why Sapolsky doesn't want to engage in this debate, because he seems to think that his definition of free will is the only plausible one. But as we shall see later, the issue of compatibilism may come back to bite him, not as a definition of free will, but simply to draw a line between events that are chosen and not chosen. For the sake of clarity, from this point forward, I will call the incompatibilist definition of free will just free will, or freely chosen choices, and the broad compatibilist definition of free will simply will, or a willful choice. This is partly to weight the discussion in Sapolsky's favour when we use the compatibilist definition of will to criticise some of his points. And also because even if you are a determinist and an incompatibilist about free will, there is no reason that you would necessarily reject the idea of willful choices altogether. And as we shall see, this distinction becomes very important. Sorry if that got a bit wordy, I hope everything's clear there. As I said, this section of the book is Sapolsky's wheelhouse, and it really shows. He persuasively argues for a number of points that are often forgotten in free will debates. For instance, if someone wants to ground free will in quantum indeterminacy, then the argumentative burden is on them to show how this is to be done. And also that just because a human being is sufficiently complex that they are unpredictable does not necessarily mean that there is genuine indeterminacy there. He also makes the oft-ignored point that indeterminate randomness will not amount to free will. And I personally really like it when people use this argument. So, that was a lightning-fast tour of the background around the free will debate that you will need to know for the rest of the video, plus some bonus foreshadowing. Now I want to move on to examining the really exciting philosophical portions of Sapolsky's book, the consequences he thinks determinism has for our other philosophical notions. Bear in mind, from this step forward, I'm going to proceed under the assumption of determinism. If you're not a determinist, then just take the rest of the video as examining the consequences of a worldview that you disagree with. This is often an interesting exercise in its own right. However, before any of that, I'd just like to thank and give a quick word from our sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform where you can take various classes on everything from video editing to writing to card tricks. Outside of this channel, one of my main hobbies is classical singing, and I've been really meaning to brush up on my music history and theory. Luckily, the Skillshare classes of Jason Allen on the complete history of music have been fantastic for this. I really enjoy using Skillshare. They've been fantastic, both for developing professional skills like video editing and touch typing, but also just for having something to watch while I'm eating that allows me to learn something new rather than just doom scrolling on social media. If you've been around the channel a while, you'll know I'm a bit of a curiosity fanatic, so Skillshare is honestly the perfect product for someone like me. The first 500 people to use my link will get 1 month of Skillshare completely free. So, give it a click, and I hope you enjoy it. And thank you, the viewer, for watching this sponsorship the whole way through. Anyway, back to the video. 2. Determinism and moral responsibility. Much of the second half of Sapolsky's book can be summarized in the following phrase: if determinism is true, then you are not responsible for your actions. It is a classic philosophical argument and has been made before, and Sapolsky's presentation of it is both clear and detailed. In propositional form, it essentially is as follows. 1. In order for someone to be morally responsible for an action, that action must be freely chosen. 2. No action is freely chosen due to determinism. Conclusion: no one is morally responsible for their actions. Sapolsky doesn't give a fleshed-out definition of moral responsibility, but in practice he often uses it to mean when something is worthy of praise or blame, or when something is morally evaluable. He also infers from this that there is no such thing as a good or bad person, since this too would have to be grounded in libertarian free will, and he doesn't believe that such a thing exists. This is a pretty simple argument structurally, but it tends to provoke extreme emotional responses. For some, it seems pretty obvious. Just as we would not hold somebody fully responsible for the things they would do when they had a gun to their head or were recently concussed because of their impaired free will, we cannot hold anyone morally responsible for anything if free will is a myth. However, for others, it seems like an insane proposition. How can it be that people are not blameworthy or praiseworthy because of their actions? It seems absurd to propose that a cold-blooded murderer is not responsible for their crimes, or conversely, that someone who has managed to overcome adversity to achieve great things is not worthy of praise. For such people, Sapolsky says his conclusion might be unintuitive, but that doesn't mean it's incorrect. And it's worth noting his argument is logically valid. If all of the premises are true, the conclusion also must be true. However, the weakest premise here is certainly premise 1. It is far from clear that moral responsibility always implies that a decision was freely made. This is especially true if you look at how people treated blame and praise outside our present time period. In the writings of some ancient Greek philosophers, they attribute moral judgment to either a person's actions or aspects of their character that are clearly not in their direct control, and they freely admit as much. For instance, Aristotle thought that being good-looking was a virtue, and this is not necessarily because he subscribed to the idea that your outward appearance was a reflection of your inner soul. It is rather that Aristotle thought lots of things were virtuous even if you didn't have any control over them. He thinks similarly for aspects of life like being rich or having had a good education. Aristotle does not claim that someone has total control over these things. Indeed, if he did, then the emphasis he places on adults and the state giving a rigorous education to their children would not make any sense. It is rather that in his writings we don't find a necessary link between free choice and moral virtue. In fact, at points he says someone that is deterministically good, that is, someone who willed to be virtuous deterministically, would actually be more praiseworthy than someone who willed to be virtuous indeterministically. Because for him, a lot of the time, virtues merely describe a disposition for consequential action, without the further need for it to be freely chosen. That is, the bulk of Aristotle's ethical system simply judges someone based on their will and that will's efficacy, regardless of whether or not that will is free in a metaphysical sense. This is a definite conceptual possibility, and one that Sapolsky doesn't pay any attention to. Likewise, in some of his notes, Friedrich Nietzsche endorses the idea that our choices are determined, but he still finds it in his heart to condemn people for those choices nonetheless, and to praise and blame people for the organization or lack thereof of their will, without the need for their choices to be freely chosen. Similarly, the Calvinist tradition of Christian theology held that people were predestined for heaven or hell with no control over this. Yet they still thought that people were praiseworthy or blameworthy on this basis because it reflected God's assessment of them and the contents of their characters. In each of these cases, you have people being judged on their will alone, without the further stipulation that that will be free. And the conceptual possibilities don't just come from history. We can find them knocking around in our current moral intuitions as well. This is because even if we say that all our choices are predetermined, that does not mean there are not further distinctions we can draw between events that are the result of our decisions and ones that are not. For instance, if I decided to rob a bank, that is, I wanted to and then I did, we would view that very differently from the situation where someone hypnotized me and forced me to rob a bank. Even if in both scenarios the events are predetermined, in one situation the causal chain runs through and in accordance with my will, whereas in the other, my will is not a relevant causal factor at all. And this highlights an important limit to the consequences of determinism. Just because there is no free will doesn't mean there is no will, and the difference between a willed action and an unwilled action often have morally relevant differences. If I hit someone in the face in accordance with my will, then we view that as morally very different to the situation where I accidentally trip and hit someone in the face. Even if both events are predetermined, the further fact of whether something is done with or without a person's will seem relevant for an agent's responsibility. Don't be fooled into thinking this is a particularly profound point. We're all familiar with the difference between a willful action and a non-willful action. It is at the very least plausible that willful choices could be responsibility-bearing even in a deterministic universe. For his part, Sapolsky points to many examples of things we used to think people were morally responsible for, but we then absolved of responsibility when we learnt the true causal mechanisms underlying the events. One example he gives is epilepsy. It used to be considered by some that an epileptic fit was a sign of demon worship, but now we know it is an involuntary malfunction. He points out that schizophrenia used to be considered the fault of the parents raising the schizophrenic child, but then its real basis was discovered and the parents were no longer held responsible. The trouble with these examples, and many others Sapolsky points to, is that these are not just situations where we discovered someone did not have free will, but rather that their will was uninvolved in the relevant causal chain at all. An epileptic does not just have no free choice in whether they have a seizure, their will, predetermined or not, is entirely idle. Whether in that moment they were willing to have a seizure or not is causally separate to the event of them having one. My grandma is epileptic and she's described this for me in pretty vivid detail. Likewise, in the parental case, it is not just that they had no free will in their child's schizophrenia. It turns out they were causally inert. To return to our two-part definition of free will from the beginning of the video, it is not just that there were no causal alternatives. It is that the causal chain simply did not run through the wills of the people involved. Thus, the situations Sapolsky is describing are disanalogous to the philosophical maneuver he is trying to make. What Sapolsky needs are situations where we recognize that someone is not free in their choice, but that the causal chain of their actions still undeniably runs through their wills. But what counts as such an example clearly rests on the further philosophical question of what the will is. For some, a will is something that is reasons responsive, whereas for others it's a pragmatic descriptor that simply sums up a person's propensities for certain certain decisions, and so on and so forth. It is not that I think there are no potential examples of this. I think that the extra difficulty someone with depression has in being fully active and engaged with the world really blurs the lines between whether they have no free will or whether they have no will at all. But Sapolsky doesn't focus on examples like this. This may be because, at points, it seems like Sapolsky does not distinguish between free will and will. For instance, in this passage, he equates a biologically determined choice with a simple reflex. We know that a decision is as purely biological as when you fling your leg out when hit on the right spot on your knee. This would rule out the idea that there can be relevant differences between a predetermined choice that is nonetheless chosen and a predetermined event that no one chooses at all. This would collapse the categories of willed events and unwilled events into one. This is not a ridiculous philosophical position by any means, but it is a substantial further point that would require argumentation. For example, it implies that there is no interesting difference in a deterministic universe between my predetermined decision to hike up a mountain and someone carrying me there while I am unconscious, or between someone who does not want to leave their room and someone who has been locked there against their will. You don't need to be anti-determinist or even necessarily compatibilist to argue that such a difference might exist or that it might be morally relevant, both for the consideration of responsibility and the evaluation of actions. If there is no intra-category decision between predetermined things someone wills and predetermined things someone doesn't will, then we are losing the intelligibility of some quite important concepts. For instance, the notion of consent. It's not that we necessarily lose these, it's just that they will have to be reconstructed. More importantly, this further equivalence is not a logical consequence of determinism by itself. It also requires an argument for either the non-existence or irrelevancy of the category of willed actions, whether or not that will is free. Funnily enough, in practice, Sapolsky does seem to recognize this distinction, because while he, quite rightly in my opinion, does not hold people with epilepsy as responsible for their seizures, he ascribes blame both to certain schools of psychoanalysis and anti-vax movements for the negative consequences their willful choices have created. This underlying intuitive distinction seems to be chugging away in the background of Sapolsky's book, even if he doesn't explicitly recognize it. The ultimate problem here is that there's just a missing step in Sapolsky's argument. He assumes premise one without really defending it. And this is a shame because it's not an indefensible premise at all. There are many arguments you can make in its favor. You could flesh out the idea that no free will implies no will and defend its unintuitive consequences. Or you could argue that their unintuitiveness is in fact an illusion. You could also give a much more in-depth argument for why willful action is genuinely insufficient for ascribing moral responsibility. However, by taking this premise for granted, Sapolsky essentially leaves the most vulnerable part of his argument completely undefended, allowing people to dismiss his whole book based on a disagreement about this premise. And I think that is a shame, because there's a lot in Sapolsky's arguments that are genuinely worth listening to, especially when it comes to our next point. 3. Free will and the law. Much like his point about moral responsibility, Sapolsky's argument against the legal system of most nations is simple but has far-reaching consequences. His primary target is what is commonly referred to as retributive justice. That is, the idea that if someone commits a crime, then they deserve the punishment. Most of us have a natural inclination towards thinking this way, hence the satisfaction that comes when we see a bully get given a taste of their own medicine, or when someone who starts shit gets hit. Sapolsky explores the evolutionary basis for this retributive urge in great detail before arguing that despite all of this, it is fundamentally unjustifiable. His argument for this is similar to his point about moral responsibility, and it is sometimes presented as a corollary of it. If there is no moral responsibility, then someone cannot deserve to be punished in any meaningful sense. Sure, they committed the crime, but they don't deserve their punishment because they could have never not committed the crime. They did not freely choose to offend. We could also bolster Sapolsky's argument with some of our own intuitions about punishment. Say you found out that one of your friends had been robbed. You might at first become indignant and demand that the full weight of the law fall upon the thief. But then you learn that he grew up in an abusive home and that he never had any real shot at a lawful career, and that ultimately he was bound to rob your friend. These explanations might soften you to the plight of the thief, and chances are the retributive urge would abate slightly. He's not a bad guy, you might think. It's just his circumstances that have led him to a life of crime. Of course, for Sapolsky, there is nothing apart from circumstances, and thus the same line of reasoning can apply to any offense. So the concept of justified retribution falls away entirely. Again, to put it in propositional form. 1. Someone cannot deserve retributive punishment if they did not freely choose to commit a crime. 2. No one freely chooses anything. Conclusion, no one can deserve retributive punishment. Of course, Sapolsky does not think that this means there should be no law or punishment, just that it should come from a place of reforming the offender or protecting society from them, rather than a more base urge to make them suffer. He also points out that since reoffending rates are much lower in countries where this more rehabilitative approach is taken, we have extremely good reason for trying it ourselves. I am very sympathetic to this argument, but it ultimately has a similar problem to his one about moral responsibility. The first premise is not nearly as obvious as Sapolsky takes it to be. Firstly, because if you think moral responsibility can exist without free will, it seems like you might also think that retributive justice can exist without free will. We could also point out that the foundations for retributive justice do not always rest upon the idea of free will, but sometimes on a nebulous notion of redressing an imbalance. For instance, the Code of Hammurabi, a Babylonian legal text that many take to be the first detailed example of retributive justice in action, states that anyone who murders anyone else will be put to death, using the principle of an eye for an eye. There is no reason that this would necessarily be based on some lofty metaphysical notion that the offender has true freedom of will. In practice, it was probably aimed at preventing blood feuds, where a killing would spark another revenge killing, which would spark a further revenge killing, and so on and so forth. So the underlying idea is not necessarily that the murderer deserves to die because of his free will, but rather to restore peace and balance in the community. On a practical level, this appeases the victim's family, preventing those nasty blood feuds. And on a philosophical level, it redresses the offence, allowing the victim or the victim's family to feel like they got even. Just to emphasize, I'm not denying that most people who argue in favor of retributive justice believe that the victim freely chose to do their crime. It's just that you could support the notion of retributive justice based on other things. As put by Roman David and Suzanne Choi, the desire for retribution refers to the victim's demand for the imposition of commensurate suffering upon their offenders. While this may involve some story about free will, it does not have to. It could rely solely on this idea of commensurability, of doing something to someone else that is just as bad as what they did. This doesn't seem to require free will, but merely will. Of course, Sapolsky could respond to this in a number of ways. He could argue that while there are a myriad of methods that you can use to attempt to ground retributive justice, the only defensible one invokes free will. I'm not saying that he's necessarily wrong about this. I don't have strong retributive urges myself, so to a certain extent I find the very notion of retributive justice a little bit unintuitive. Once again, it simply requires further argumentation. It doesn't follow directly from determinism. However, there is a much more interesting argument in Sapolsky's book that he almost brushes under the carpet, which is a shame because I think it's a lot stronger. That is, the insight from determinism that people are a product of their environment suggests that we can change someone from having a disposition towards crime to becoming a law-abiding citizen. While rehabilitative justice does not follow logically from determinism, it does get a strong vote in its favour. If determinism is true, then we cannot maintain a notion that someone just has a will that is good or bad and isn't subject to change over time. Instead, we have to recognise them and their wills as enmeshed in a causal process, one which we have the ability to alter in order to help someone not do any more harm. In all of this talk about someone deserving punishment, I think we miss a far more impactful argument in favour of rehabilitation. Under determinism, no one is good or bad apart from as a result of causal factors. So control the causal factors and you affect someone's character. That is, it raises the possibility of making people good through definite interventions in their environment. This is a marked departure from the idea that many of us have swimming in the back of our heads that some people are just metaphysically rotten, that they are born bad, they live bad, and they die bad, with their circumstance or environment simply not coming into it. For the record, determinism can make the same sort of suggestion regarding moral responsibility. In my eyes, the important thing that determinism highlights is not that praise or blame are always inappropriate. It is that they might not be the most productive route forward if you want to change someone's behaviour. This holds most obviously for things like addiction, where a mixture of genetic and social factors can make it much more difficult for some people to quit than others, but also for a myriad of other actions. For instance, if I'm encountering focus issues with one of my students, it might be more helpful to ask them how their home environment is, rather than lambast them to simply work harder. Being reminded that our choices are conditional is not a bad thing. It is just that this by itself does not imply the broad philosophical changes Sapolsky is arguing for. Rather than determinism entailing that we are mistaken about almost every part of our moral system, I think it instead suggests certain alterations we can make. And following this thought, I want to move on to what I thought was the most interesting part of Sapolsky's argument, and the questions it raises about our approach to philosophy. 4. Conceptions of will and responsibility. It's not particularly controversial to say that philosophy has undergone a profound shift in the past couple of centuries. With the advent of modern science and the increasing embrace of physicalism, a huge portion of our common-sense philosophical concepts have had to be changed. We have become much more suspicious about positing objects we cannot directly observe, and rely much less on concepts like God or the soul for our philosophical argumentation. The thing I find really fascinating about Sapolsky's book is that it demonstrates how this particular tension and development manifests in the debates around free will and responsibility. As I said, Sapolsky thinks the only way our choices can ground moral responsibility is if they are uncaused causes, yet at the same time are not random. However, the influence of the idea of a soul on this demand is evident. Sapolsky essentially says we would only be free and thus morally responsible if our will was something separate from the causal chain of material reality, yet could also somehow influence that reality. This is almost beat for beat the notion of an agential soul put forward by religious thinkers like Descartes. It paints us as a sort of spiritual homunculus at the driver's seat of our body without truly being our body. It is not that you couldn't make a physicalist picture of the will that fulfills this demand, but it is clearly influenced by the notion of an agential soul taking the reins of our actions. To clarify, I'm not suggesting that Sapolsky believes in the human soul. In fact, I'm 99% sure that he doesn't. It is rather that his criteria that an agent must fulfill in order to be free is influenced by a dualist metaphysics that Sapolsky himself does not subscribe to. So in some ways, it's actually quite unsurprising that nothing lives up to his definition of free will. But as I shall explore, this suggests that we might want to revise our idea of free will entirely, reconstructing it rather than just giving it up. The same goes for our idea of moral responsibility. Culturally, many of us have inherited the notion that we are individual moral agents who bear the mark of our actions on our souls. At one point, this was with the further idea that we would be judged on the last day by God. But even without that, our everyday concept still contains this idea that we are individual, distinct ontological units capable of bearing moral properties. Moreover, the view of many of the monotheistic religions that historically dominated Europe, the US, and the Middle East is that our moral decisions are freely chosen, and could have been otherwise. This is what, in practice, is often used to ground moral responsibility. I think that Sapolsky, quite rightly, points out that determinism would blow this particular idea of free will and this particular conception of moral responsibility completely out of the water. However, I think he makes the mistake of thinking that these are the only possible or plausible conceptions of moral responsibility or willful choice that exist. But in doing so, he highlights what I think is a very exciting question. What revisions of our concepts should take place on a deterministic worldview? About 2 years ago, I became briefly obsessed with a field of philosophy known as conceptual engineering. Whereas much of quote-unquote traditional philosophy aims to understand our concepts as they exist and provide logical explications of them, conceptual engineering instead attempts a subtly different task. Instead of asking what is X, it asks what should X be given how we want the concept to function. The key question raised by Sapolsky's work is, what is the purpose of our concept of moral responsibility, and how should we characterize it in a deterministic world? Sapolsky only sees one plausible idea of moral responsibility, so he condemns it as an unjust concept used to blame, condemn, or praise people for no good reason. But another person might say that the underlying purpose we're aiming at with our definition of moral responsibility is to allow us to differentiate between those actions which are the result of a person's predetermined choices and which are not. They could, like Strawson, propose that what we're really interested in when someone is acting is what that says about their future actions and attitudes towards us. There could be numerous other proposals as well. These are just a couple of examples. And seen like this, Sapolsky's work becomes immensely valuable. Even if we don't accept his idea that determinism implies no moral responsibility, it can nonetheless inform the way we reconstruct that concept. For instance, it suggests that in any new definition of moral responsibility, we should aim to understand the causes of how someone has come to make a decision, rather than seeing decisions as simply evidence of a defective personality or something like that. It can let us know that improving human action is not just a matter of telling people to try harder, but partly understanding the multitudinous factors that create a healthy psyche, and maximizing those throughout our society as much as possible. These are perfectly reasonable limits and nudges determinism might place on the construction of any new concept of responsibility. So to conclude, I think that Sapolsky's book is brilliant at refuting a particular idea of the relationship between free will and moral responsibility. However, it is arguably also a prelude to even more exciting work, which asks what new concepts of willful action, responsibility, freedom, punishment, and deservingness we might put in their place. Because there is substantial philosophy still to be done here, and reading Sapolsky's book is sure to get your mind churning about what some of these new ideas might look like. Sometimes, reading his book, I get the sense Sapolsky intended this to be a way of closing an issue, but I think he has done something far greater than that. He has brought a whole series of new, exciting questions into the public eye, perhaps without even knowing it. But if you want to learn about lots of aspects of the free will debate we did not get to cover here, then click on this video to get a better grounding in the overall philosophical issue. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.